And the topic of this class is intermarriage, choices, and consequences. The sources that we're going to look at today relate to the first unit of the class, where we're going to attempt to spell out the sources that have formed the basis for the notion that Jewish-Gentile intimacy and marriage is problematic or forbidden. That's the first unit. Then we're going to move to the second unit. And the sources that I sent you, by the way, are all related to the first unit. In the second unit, we'll see if there's any possible pathway for justifying and embracing intermarriage from the rabbinic tradition and what we would have to say in order to do that. And then in the third unit, we're going to focus on the deeper questions about Judaism that I think are at stake in this discussion. I'll lay out some different models for thinking about Judaism through the prism of intermarriage and what consequences our choices might carry in this regard. Hence the class's subtitle, Choices and Consequences. Now, before we begin, I have to confess something. I have had these sources prepared sitting in my Dropbox folder for a while now. They were originally presented, arranged, and prepared by my friend and teacher, Rabbi Ethan Tucker from Machon Hadar in New York. But I have been reluctant to give this class. Why? Well, I think there's scarcely a better way to ensure that Jews will get angry at you than by talking about intermarriage. There is virtually nothing that can be said on this topic without offending or angering someone. I have learned that by now. I saw it when Rabbi Sachs courageously spoke about this topic from the Bima last High Holidays and saw how the congregation reacted to his sermon. If I was going to take an overly conciliatory tone, that's seen as a form of national and religious betrayal by many. If I take a more restrictive stand, no matter how principled, it is often seen as exclusionary, hurtful, and isolationist. By giving this class, I realize that I am stepping into the lion's den and perhaps inviting some conflict. But after some reflection, I realize that this inability to have a sophisticated intellectual conversation about this topic, it only strengthens the rationale for this class. Folks, there are few topics on which I think some form of shared discourse is more necessary than intermarriage. We have to be able to talk about intermarriage and not have to worry about offending somebody. The North American Jewish community is living today in a new reality in which not only are intermarriage rates high, but self-identified Jews of mixed heritage are an increasingly dominant part of the Jewish landscape. Maybe we don't see that so much in Toronto, but in many other places in North America, intermarriage is simply the new normal. And as far as facts on the ground are concerned, I agree with Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who is the head of the Union of Reform Judaism, who said a few years back that being against intermarriage is like being against gravity. There is no future on the horizon in which intermarriage and families of mixed heritage are not a central part of the North American Jewish landscape, of North American Jewish life. And the only options are therefore, either we can sequester ourselves from it as much as possible and pretend like it doesn't exist, or we can figure out a way to talk about it and respond to it respectfully, how to have conversations respectfully. Now, for the most part, The public conversation that the Jewish community has on this issue is demographic. That's the way we talk about intermarriage. It all comes down often to demography. Those opposed to intermarriage tout statistics that show vast numbers of intermarried Jews having an attenuated connection to Jewish life. Other Jewish institutions try to find ways to increase engagement of mixed heritage families. You may not believe it, but literally hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested right now in efforts to increase the Jewish activity of members of intermarried households. And the demographic conversation, make no mistake about it, it goes both ways. If you're an enthusiast of intermarriage, you will argue that it will be a net plus for expanding the number of households containing Jews. And that if we engage properly intermarried families, they can be a key element of an expansionist strategy that allows Judaism to spread to more and more people. To my mind, this demographic discussion is all wrong. And in this class, I want to get as far away as possible from the demographics because I think it is missing something major. And that's not because the statistics are incorrect. It is definitely true that a cold look at the broad picture of intermarriage in North America is one that correlates with lesser involvement, lesser engagement, lesser practice when it comes to Judaism.
Exactly.
No one's going to argue that point. But it is equally, indubitably true that various forms of engagement that engage families on their own terms, intermarried families, produce outcomes of bringing people close and engaging them in Jewish life. And if we were having this debate in a synagogue boardroom, talking about how we should invest limited assets in Jewish life, okay, then I would be open to talking about the demography. We simply have tough choices to make. But in this series, I would like us to abandon the demographic frame on this topic, and to do so for three reasons. Number one, as a number of researchers have already pointed out, even if every non-Jewish person currently married to a Jew converted to Judaism, we would still be facing a major demographic challenge because outside of Orthodoxy, there is negative population growth. The problem is not intermarriage as much as it is the small number of children that North American Jews have and the tiny number of converts that we attract outside of marriage. If you want to talk about the fundamental demographic threats to our community's future, let's talk about that before we talk about intermarriage. That's number one. Number two, there's a funny thing about statistics. They don't help you very much in dealing with human beings who are standing in front of you. Let's say the statistics showed that people from single-parent households are much less likely to take up a musical instrument and stick to it. Would you ever use those statistics to turn away an aspiring piano player who had no father or mother at home? In that sense, Jewish institutions, I think, make a big mistake when they treat and evaluate cases of intermarriage the same way we would evaluate an IPO on the stock market. Each person's story is different. For most people who are faced with this dilemma, these are intense and potentially very difficult religious moments that don't require an answer based on statistics. They require a religious response, a personal response. That's number two. And number three, something I've said over and over again to our board at Beth Tikva. I don't know how much they listen to me, but something I've said over and over again. Demography has never been, and it should not be, the North Star for making Jewish and halachic policy decisions for our synagogue or for our community. There is no commandment anywhere in the Torah that says you have to maximize the number of Jews in the world. There's no commandment that says you have to grow the Jewish population. Actually, the Torah says God chose us from among the nations because we're small in number. So if we want to respond to the challenge of intermarriage, the goal shouldn't be to just increase. It should be to channel what our values, our tradition, our Torah have to say. We spend way too much time counting Jews. And when we spend too many time counting Jews, we start to forget what those Jews are supposed to do, what those Jews are supposed to stand for in the world, and how they're supposed to live out their covenant with God. So I want to invite you all in this series into a different conversation. It's one that's about what our sources and our values have to say about intermarriage. A conversation that can think about our tradition and what it thinks about intimacy and marriage between Jews and non-Jews as an issue on its own terms. And I think that's the only way to ground the conversation in substance and the only way to get to the bottom of why intermarriage has been and remains a flashpoint in so many Jewish quarters. The shift away from demography, it's not going to immunize us from, sorry for the pun, it's not going to immunize us from the contentious discourse that defines this topic, but I think that our sources can refine our perspectives on the issue and perhaps suggest some better ways of talking about this topic that will enable a more reasoned and transparent discussion. Now, I want to be upfront so there are no surprises. I am speaking as someone coming from a traditional rabbinic Jewish perspective and committed to listening and being accountable to that textual normative tradition. You probably know this, but intermarriage for that tradition is simply never a positive good. Nonetheless, there is, surprisingly, I think, some nuance around what we might expect to be a simple yes-no topic. And to the extent that intermarriage has been viewed with a jaundiced eye by the rabbinic tradition, the question instead should be, what is this about? What is this prohibition against intermarriage about? Has it been a strong formal prohibition from the beginning? Or is it just a social instinct that Jews have always had? Is it rooted in the Bible? Or did this happen later? Is it found in some later authority? To what extent is intermarriage a primary concern? This is going to be a big question in this class. And to what extent is it actually a derivative of other concerns that we have? How much are the concerns around intermarriage really about sex? An overriding question for us throughout this class is going to be, to the extent that intermarriage is problematic in a given source, why? That's the question I always want everybody in the class to be asking as we read through these sources. To the extent that it is problematic in a source, why is it problematic? Why is that so? And perhaps the most central question, the one that will occupy much of the last unit of this series, is whether the contemporary discussion around intermarriage is really about intermarriage, or is our discussion about intermarriage today really just a proxy discussion for another discussion about what Judaism is and what Judaism ought to be, and what is the ongoing role, if any, that the Jewish people, the plays in defining and delimiting what Judaism is. But we have a ways to go before we get there, I promise you. We got a lot to do beforehand. So why don't we start? What do you say? Enough with Rabbi Grover talking. Let's start actually looking at the Torah. We always have to start there and see what the Torah has to say about this topic. I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the sources on the screen? Great. And if you missed the first part of the lecture, again, these sources are downloadable. You just have to click the link that is found in the text or the chat section on your screens. Okay, so my first victim is going to be you, Stan, because I see you and Debbie interested. So I'm going to assume that means you're capable and interested and able to read.
Yes.
So what we're going to look at to begin with, you all know that in the book of Genesis, right, there's all sorts of talk about who you can marry. You know, Abraham has this discussion with his servant Eliezer. Don't take a daughter from among the inhabitants of the land for my son Isaac. But I'm sort of skipping over those stories in Genesis because they're anecdotal. It's not a commandment, right? These are stories of our patriarchs worried about who their children will marry, but it doesn't lead those sources to any prohibition that is meant to extend beyond that particular case. All we know about from the book of Genesis is that our patriarchs are concerned, and the Torah doesn't mention every detail in their life, but it definitely makes a point of explaining that the test or the concern of who the children will marry is crucial. It's a crucial part of the way we have to look at the patriarchs, evaluate their life, learn from their decisions. It's not until the book of Exodus where we see a commandment that is meant to extend beyond just a particular case from or a particular family in the Torah, and is meant to extend beyond throughout the generations some concern about marriage. So we can go back to this at the end of the class when we have our discussion. I know I've skipped over all of those stories, but I'm trying to explain why. I want to stick with the clear commandments and instructions in the Torah that I think reveal a lot about this topic. Okay, Stan, go ahead.
Yes. So Exodus 34, 11, 16. Obey what I command you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites.
Right. So do you recognize?
Jebusites.
I don't know if anybody recognizes those names, but those are the names of the tribes or the peoples that live in the land of Canaan at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. And so God says, here's the plan. You're going to wander in the desert. You're going to eventually make your way to this place called Canaan. And in that land, I know there's a lot of people that live there, but don't worry, I'm going to drive them out. Right? This is the promise that God makes. All the peoples that live in that land, they'll be gone some way, somehow.
Okay. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you.
Okay, so this is an interesting thing. That the previous verse, Stan, that you just read said, I'm going to drive them out. But then the verse you just read seems to suggest they're still going to be around.
Yeah.
Right? Because it says, don't make a treaty with them. So there's a little bit of a conflict here. Are they still going to be around? Or so what does drive out mean? That's a question you might want to underline in that source. Drive out may not mean I'm going to destroy them. It sounds like what it means is you will dominate these tribes. They won't get in your way, right? You will rule over these tribes. Don't make a treaty with them. What do you think, Stan, is meant here by treaty?
You want to politically get along with them.
I think it's more. I think
socialize with them.
I think the Torah is saying, I don't want you getting along with them. I want the position of the Jewish people in the land of Canaan to be dominant. You don't need to make a treaty with the people that you dominate. You make treaties with people that you want to share with. So you would be treating them as equals if you would be making a treaty with them. The treaty would be an exchange of rights. You have the right to this, and we have the right to that. And God says, I don't want you doing that. I have something better than a treaty. You're just going to dominate them, and they will do whatever you say. And I don't want you to make a treaty with them because they will be a snare among you. The Hebrew is mokesh. Anyone know what mokesh is in modern Hebrew? A sde mokshim are, oh my God, why is my brain not working? Those things in the ground that will explode. Help me, Stan.
Mines.
Mines, thank you. They will. That's a mokesh in Hebrew, and it's a beautiful image, right? If you make a treaty with them, you might step on a mine and it will explode, right? You may think you're making peace with them, but what you're actually doing is giving them rights and protections that could eventually blow up in your face. Isn't Hebrew a fascinating language? Mine is obviously not a word that exists in biblical Hebrew, but this is where modern Hebrew got the idea from: a snare, something that traps you and you might be unaware that it's doing so. Okay, so don't make a treaty with them or it might be a snare among you. Go ahead, Stan.
Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same.
Okay, so there's a little bit to unpack there. Thank you, Stan. So what we see here is perhaps a definition of what that snare or what that mine is that the Torah is afraid the Jewish people will step on. It is primarily I hope you all see, a fear for the religious integrity of the people. If you make a treaty with them, you're going to be protecting their right to worship their God as they see fit. And that means if they have that right, they will entice you or invite you to do all kinds of abominations before their gods. They might even ask you to eat of their sacrifices, and that will be a challenge, to say the least, to the religious integrity of the people. And then this last verse, which is the verse that I think relates to this topic, it's spelled out clearly what that might lead to. You will choose, the more you mix together, the greater likelihood there'll be that you'll choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters will continue to practice the religion of their forefathers. They will continue to practice the religion that they were used to. And what will they do? Well, they're the closest person to them is their husband and their kids. So she will invite her husband and her children to also participate in that idolatrous cultic worship. And that is what the Torah is worried about. So I have a couple of questions about this source. I hope some of you do too. We can discuss it a bit later. Question number one, notice, so question number one, is this a prohibition against intermarriage? Yes or no? It's not clear that it is. There are only 6 nations that are mentioned here. And these 6 nations are particularly problematic because they are native to the land of Canaan. And it is conceivable, I'm not saying that it's for sure, but it is conceivable that the Torah is particularly worried about these 6 nations more than other nations because they are native to the land. When you bring someone over to marry your son who comes from, Ireland and moves to Canaan, that person may not be as likely to continue worshiping their Irish God because they've moved and there's no Irish church. You'll excuse all the metaphors. There's no Irish church nearby for her to attend and bring her children to. But if your son is marrying a Jebusite, well, the Jebusite church is right there. And I'm worried that the Jebusite will take her kids to church because it's so accessible. Much more worried about that than about the Irish wife, because that Irish wife is more likely to assimilate into whatever religion the family is practicing, because that institutional or civic foundation is not there in the community to further her practicing the religion that she formerly adhered to. So that's the first question I have. Is this a blanket prohibition or not? And the second question in this source is, what is the primary concern? Is the primary concern intermarriage, or is the primary concern a religious concern? And intermarriage just is the secondary. It's the corollary, right? What the Torah is really worried about is diminishing religious integrity, fervor among the people, and intermarriage is just going to help that process move along faster? Or is intermarriage the real concern here, or even an equal concern to the loss of that religious integrity, and therefore should be weighed this in the same way. So I don't have answers to those questions. I'm just opening up the discussion. Remember, I promised you in the introduction, there is more nuance here than you might expect. If the Torah wanted to say, don't intermarry, the Torah could have said it. But this is the way, at least in the entire book of Exodus, the Torah talks about intermarriage. It's in the context of making treaties with the people who are living among you. Now, the next source comes from the book of Deuteronomy, but before we get there, I have jumped to Deuteronomy. I've jumped over a section of the Bible which, if you didn't know any better, you probably would wager that a prohibition against intermarriage would be included, where that prohibition would be included. In the book of Leviticus, there's a section called the Holiness Code. Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. And in that section, all of the sexual crimes are listed. Cursed be the one who sleeps with his father's wife, cursed be the one who, etc., etc. Your sister, all of the bestiality, all of the homosexuality, it's all delineated in that section of the Torah. So why did I skip over it? I skipped over it because there is a glaring omission in that section of the Torah. In the place where you would most expect the Torah to say, and don't engage in sexual encounters with non-Jews, with foreign women, there is no such verse. I'm skipping over it because there's nothing to include. Sometimes the Talmud says, Omrim min lav. Sorry, lomdim min halav. Sometimes you learn from omission. I'm not saying we should. I'm saying it's odd. If one wanted to say that the prohibition against intermarriage or sex with a non-Jew is biblical, one would certainly look in the Holiness Code for justification. And yet, can't find anything. So notice what I've skipped over. This space that you see on the screen where the hand is, that there's something to learn there. Everything that I'm skipping over. And then we get to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, as you know, repeats many of the rules that were already delivered in earlier sections of the Torah. But sometimes you find new information. So Debbie,
Yes.
since you're also in the screen and I already have you on unmute, would you do us the honor, and you'll pardon my interruptions, of reading these verses from Deuteronomy?
When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you.
Remember, it was 6 in Exodus. So there was, I have to see which was the nation that was added. Let's see. We have the Amorites, we have the Canaanites, we have the Hittites, we have the Perizzites. So it's the Girgashites.
The Girgashites.
The Girgashites made it onto the list in the book of Exodus's numeration. But I want us to pay attention to this this idea of the 7 nations, because in later Jewish sources, there's constant references to the Shiv'a Amamim, the 7 native nations to the land of Canaan, and this is what that is referring to.
7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them.
Okay, stop there for a second. You can see in the Hebrew, velo titchatein bam. Do not intermarry with them. The book of Exodus doesn't say it that clearly. The book of Exodus could be read in sort of a narrative way. When you choose some of your daughters when you do this, when you choose some of their daughters to be wives. Sorry, can you hear me now, everyone?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yes.
It could be read in a narrative way. When you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, then this bad stuff is going to happen. You could read it that way, the book of Exodus. But in Deuteronomy, you can't. In Deuteronomy, it's not a narrative. This is a law. Velo titchatein bam. Do not intermarry with them. Now, who are them? That's, remember my question from the book of Exodus. Them here, does that mean any other nation? Or are we talking only about the 7 native nations to the land of Canaan? Think about that.
Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you.
Okay, so this verse 4 also bothers me. And remember, I said with every source, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why is the Torah saying, do not intermarry with them here? Is the intermarriage the primary concern? Or is what verse 4 doing, this last sentence, is verse 4 explaining what the first order concern is? The first order concern is their kids will turn your kids away from Hashem. Therefore, don't intermarry with them. Or is it saying, don't intermarry with them, because if you do, this might happen? There are different ways of understanding what the Torah's prohibition in both of these sources, what it actually is. Are we talking only about 7 nations, or are we talking about all non-Jews? And is intermarriage the primary concern? Or is this about fundamentally a loss of religious integrity that an intermarriage only makes more expedient? Those are the 2 sources in the Torah that specifically legislate or might legislate against intermarriage. And again, I just want to emphasize, let's learn from what's not written in the Torah as much as we're learning from what is written in the Torah. I did not include the source in the Torah that says, remember the captive woman, the section of the Torah that deals with a captive foreign woman? If you conquer a nation and you find there a woman that you are attracted to and you want to marry her, you have to do this and this and this. Well, hold on. That sounds like the Torah is saying you're permitted to marry a foreign woman. And leave that story aside. What about the Book of Ruth? Anyone here in this class do my series in the summer on the Book of Ruth? Ruth was a Moabite woman. She is called Ruth HaMoaviyah. Why is it then that the laws of levirate marriage are applying to her from the beginning of that book? Even though she is a foreign woman, she's being treated like a Jew. So some people say, oh, she converted. It doesn't say that anywhere in the book. It is very, very possible that in the time of the Bible, there was no prohibition against intermarriage, no blanket prohibition against intermarriage. There may have been some prohibition against marrying from the 7 native nations. That could be. But it could also be that these 2 sections from the Torah are not prohibitions, they're just stern warnings about what could happen if you intermarry. We understand that some of you will intermarry. Hashem says you probably shouldn't, because if you do, this and this is going to happen. But this is advice, not a clear prohibition. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just saying it's one of the ways that you could understand biblical Judaism. One of the ways that you could understand intermarriage in the time of the Bible. And indeed, many scholars would agree that in the time of the Bible, there was no prohibition against intermarriage, just this sort of cautious language, disapproval, public disapproval, but no public disapproval and concern, but no prohibition. We have to talk about King Solomon if we're going to discuss this topic. So, Gloria, would you help with the reading?
I'll try.
And let's talk about Solomon, and we know about his weaknesses. Here's another example of a challenge for those who say that intermarriage is banned in the Bible. Well, what about King Solomon, who, as you know, is supposed to be an example of religious piety to the people and seems to have married from not just from the 7 nations, but from every nation conceivable. Go ahead, Gloria.
Okay. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, he's got the whole pack here.
Right.
Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless,
So here, if I was to ask you, how does the Book of Kings, how does it understand the prohibition against intermarriage in the Torah? Clearly, according to the Book of Kings, that ban against intermarriage applies to the 7 nations. It is not a blanket prohibition, because you see here how the text points out only the bad women. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, they were the nations that God said, don't intermarry with them, comma, and not other women, because those were not included in the prohibition. So if you were going to say that the Torah's prohibition against intermarriage is not comprehensive. It only applies to the 7 nations. This is a source that would help you make your case.
They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
So the Torah the prophecy of the Torah is coming true through the real life story of Solomon. His wives led him astray, and astray here means from a religious perspective. Take a look. Go ahead, Gloria.
As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab.
Wow.
All right. And for Moab, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's commands. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen.
Now, thank you, Gloria. One should not underestimate the power of these stories related to the kings of Israel, the United Kingdom, and then later the divided kingdom. The power of these stories in defining the later culture and practice of the Jewish people, almost as much as the Torah is there to legislate doing this and doing that. The stories from the Book of Kings are tremendously powerful. The Book of Solomon, not Solomon, the Book of Samuel and the Book of Kings are very powerful, liturgically especially, in delineating Jewish practice, and because we learn from their lessons. Biblical scholars even say that during the time of the kings, sections were added to the Book of Deuteronomy, particularly the Book of Deuteronomy, to emphasize the screw-ups of the kings of Israel. So in other words, it's conceivable to think that what happened first was Solomon, according to biblical scholars, this story of Solomon, which defined, I mean, you can see the language here, which defines his monarchy. His monarchy becomes defined. This is the man who built the temple. But instead of talking about that glorious and amazing achievement, we're talking about other temples that he built. I mean, think about how this ruins the reputation of the Jewish temple. It's just one of many other temples that he built, all because of the foreign women that he married. Pay attention here to when the emphasis is on the 7 nations and when it just says foreign wives. It's not clear here that the 7 that the wives from the 7 nations were any worse than the other wives. It's just these are the ones that seem to be the most successful in in encouraging or enticing Solomon to build those foreign temples, right? Because even though he was married to Pharaoh's daughter, he doesn't build an Egyptian temple. For the same reason that I was saying it's unlikely you'd build an Irish church in the land of Canaan at the time, right? What are the people going to do with an Egyptian temple? But Solomon built a high place for the detestable god of the Moabites and the detestable god of the Ammonites. Well, these people are all around. I can be everyone will love me if I build, in addition to the Jewish temple, an Ammonite temple and a Moabite temple. So the way this story plays out in Solomon's life, the things he does basically on the initiative of his foreign wives, I think comes to define later attitudes on intermarriage. And again, I ask the question, what is the primary concern here? What is this text most upset about? And it's not clear. Is it the foreign women, or is it Solomon's devotion to the foreign gods? Which one is the text most upset about? I leave that as a question. We'll end with this last source from Malachi before I open up for discussion. Thank you, Gloria. Mel, could you read for us the source from Malachi? You're the next one on my screen.
Unmute. Okay. Malachi. Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty.
The reason why, thanks, Mel. The reason why I thought to include this source, the language that he uses when Malachi says a foreign god, by the time of Malachi, those 7 nations are gone. That's what you have to understand in reading this source. In the time of King Solomon, those 7 nations were still around. And that's why there was such anger that Solomon went ahead and married from tribes that were specifically mentioned in the Torah to be problematic. But by the time of Malachi, something has changed. Those 7 nations are no longer around. And yet, there's that the marriage with foreign women is still a problem. So if I was going to advance the view, just as I said, if you want to say that the biblical prohibition against intermarriage only applies to the 7 nations, you would quote this source in the Book of Kings. Well, if you wanted to advance the point of view that the ban against intermarriage applied to all foreign women, you would quote from the Book of Malachi. Malachi says, here's this detestable thing that's going on. You've married foreign women. But again, I just want to add, in case you've missed it in this source, it says something more than just foreign women, doesn't it? Look at the Hebrew. Uva'al bat el nechar. These are not foreign women in the sense that they come from a different country, that their passport has a different country on the front page. These are foreign women because of their religion, because they are Baal bat el nechar. that maybe a literal translation would be the daughters of a foreign god. It's not that their passport is different. It's that they were still practicing their religion and you married them. That's really important, I think, to distinguish here in the source, right? Especially when we're asking the question, what is the primary concern? I think this gives some help for those who want to say the primary concern is not intermarriage. It's that these women will lead their husbands astray. That's the problem. So I'm going to end the recording now. It's a good place, actually, to end the recording. And